The great hall of Elthara Prime echoed with the sound of heavy footsteps. Massive stone pillars reached up toward the dark ceiling, carved with images of ancient battles and conquered worlds. The air smelled of iron and old blood, a reminder of the Velthari way of life. Elder Korthak entered the hall slowly. His body was covered in thick, dark scales that had turned silver with age. 6 powerful limbs carried his 3-meter frame with careful grace. Deep scars crossed his face and arms, telling stories of countless battles. His yellow eyes glowed in the dim light as he looked around the room. 20 young Velthari warriors waited for him. They sat in a perfect circle on the cold stone floor, their own scales still bright and unmarked by battle. These were the next generation of hunters about to begin their first real hunt. According to ancient tradition, they had to hear the wisdom of their elders before they could prove themselves worthy of the hunt. The young ones whispered among themselves, excited and nervous. Their sharp claws clicked against the stone as they shifted restlessly. Some had waited years for this moment. Others had trained their entire lives just to sit in this circle. Korthak moved to the center of the circle and sat down heavily. The hall became silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant wind outside. He looked at each young face, remembering when he had been like them. That felt like a lifetime ago. Young hunters, Korthak began, his voice deep and rough like grinding stone. Today you will hear about the most dangerous prey in the galaxy. The warriors leaned forward with interest. They had heard stories of the crystal beings who could walk through walls. They knew about the mind readers who could kill with a thought. Some had learned about the shape changers who could look like anyone. Tell us about the Nexari, Elder, said Yejin, a female warrior with bright green scales. They say their bodies are harder than starship armor. Korthak shook his head slowly. The Nexari are strong, yes, but they are not the most dangerous. The Zephyrite, then, suggested Minho, whose black scales marked him as coming from the mountain clans. They can control minds and make armies. Fight for them. Again, Korthak shook his head. The Zephyrite are clever and their powers are great, but they are still not what I will speak of today. The young warriors looked confused. They glanced at each other, trying to think of what could be more dangerous than the legendary enemies they had heard about since childhood. Hyun-Soo, the largest of the group, spoke up. Elder, what prey could be more dangerous than those who can phase through matter or control thoughts? Korthak was quiet for a long moment. He seemed to be remembering something from far away. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange tone that the young ones had never heard before. It was not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something like respect. I will tell you about humans, he said simply. The circle erupted in confused murmurs. Several warriors laughed outright. Jisoo, known for her quick temper, actually snorted with amusement. Humans, Elder? She said. The weak pink creatures from the 3rd planet of Sol system? They barely have space travel. They have no natural weapons or armor. Their technology is centuries behind ours. They live on only one world, added Sungmin. They fight among themselves constantly. They die if they go too long without food or water or air. How can such weak beings be dangerous? More laughter filled the hall. The young warriors had studied humans in their basic xenobiology classes. They knew humans were soft creatures with thin skin and fragile bones. They had no claws, no fangs, no scales for protection. They could not even see well in the dark or hear sounds beyond a narrow range. Korthak waited patiently for the laughter to die down. His scarred face showed no anger at their disrespect, only a sad kind of knowledge. You laugh because you think strength comes only from sharp claws and thick armor, he said when the hall was quiet again. You believe danger comes only from powerful weapons and advanced technology. This is why you are still younglings. The warriors fell silent, suddenly unsure. Elder Korthak had fought in more battles than any living Velthari. He had personally killed the leaders of 3 different species. His tactical genius had won victories against impossible odds. If he said humans were dangerous, there had to be a reason. 25 years ago, Korthak continued, I thought as you do now. I believed that the strong ruled the weak by natural right. I thought that victory always went to whoever had the biggest weapons and the most advanced ships. He stood up slowly, his old joints creaking. Moving to one of the carved pillars, he traced a scar that ran across his left arm with one claw. This scar came from a human weapon, he said. Not an energy beam or projectile cannon. A simple piece of sharpened metal, thrown by hand by a creature that weighed less than half what I do. The young warrior stared in disbelief. How could any thrown weapon pierce Velthari scales? The human who gave me this scar was called Jiho Kim, Korthak said, still touching the old wound. He was a mining supervisor, not even a soldier. When we attacked his colony, he fought with tools meant for digging rocks. He should have died in the first minutes of battle. Korthak turned back to face the circle. Instead, he held off an entire Velthari strike team for 6 hours. 6 hours, with nothing but mining equipment and the help of workers who had never seen combat. That is impossible, whispered Dawan, the youngest of the group. Mining tools cannot hurt trained warriors. You are right, Korthak agreed. Mining tools alone cannot hurt us, but mining tools in the hands of someone who refuses to give up can become something else entirely. He began to pace around the circle, his footsteps echoing in the vast hall. Jiho Kim turned air recyclers into poison gas dispensers. He made explosive charges from fertilizer used for growing food. He used gravity generators meant for ore processing to create weapons that could crush our battle armor. The warriors listened with growing amazement. Such creativity in battle was almost unthinkable to them. Velthari fought with honor, using proper weapons in proper ways. The idea of turning peaceful tools into instruments of war seemed almost like cheating. But it was not his cleverness that made him dangerous, Korthak said, stopping his pacing. It was something else. Something we had never encountered before in all our centuries of conquest. What was it, Elder? Asked Yejin quietly. Korthak Quota's yellow eyes seemed to glow brighter in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried clearly through the silent hall. Jiho Kim fought not because he thought he could win. He knew he would die. He fought not to save his own life or to gain honor in battle. He fought because 26 other humans were counting on him to give them time to escape. The old warrior sat down heavily again, suddenly looking very tired. For 6 hours I watched this weak, soft creature face certain death rather than abandon others of his kind. I watched him take wounds that should have stopped him and keep fighting anyway. I watched him sacrifice everything he had, not for victory, not for glory, but simply to buy time for people he cared about. The hall was completely silent now. Even the wind outside seemed to have stopped. That, young hunters, is why the Velthari Council has declared humans too dangerous to hunt, Korthak said with finality. Any species that will fight that hard for each other is not prey. They are something else entirely. What are they then, Elder? Asked Hyunsu in a small voice. Korthak looked around the circle at all the young faces staring back at him. They no longer looked excited about their coming hunt. They looked thoughtful, maybe even worried. That, he said with something that might have been a smile, is what I will tell you next. Elder Korthak shifted his weight on the stone floor and looked up at the carved ceiling. The young warriors waited in silence, their earlier amusement completely gone. They had never seen their elder look so serious when telling battle stories. 25 years ago, Korthak began, his voice echoing in the great hall. I was not yet an elder. I served under Commander Vexoth as part of the 3rd Scouting Fleet. Our job was simple. We would find new systems with useful resources and claim them for the Velthari Empire. The old warrior paused and flexed his claws. The young ones could see old scars between his scales, marks left by battles they could only imagine. We had done this work for many years, he continued. Most species we encountered would surrender immediately when they saw our ships. Those that tried to fight rarely lasted more than a few hours. It was routine work, easy work. Yejin leaned forward. What made the human encounter different, Elder? Korthak turned his yellow eyes toward her. Everything, he said simply. From the very beginning, nothing went as we expected. He stood up and began pacing again, his heavy footsteps marking time as he spoke. The system we found was called Sol by the humans who lived there. It had 8 planets, but only one with life. The third planet, which they called Earth. But we were not interested in their world. We wanted the asteroid belt between the 4th and 5th planets. Asteroids? Asked Minho. What could be valuable about floating rocks? These rocks contained rare metals that we needed for our ship engines, Korthak explained. Metals that were very difficult to find elsewhere. When our scouts reported the discovery, Commander Vexoth was pleased. It seemed like an easy mission. The elder stopped pacing and looked at each young face in the circle. The humans had a small mining operation in the asteroid belt. Just one station with maybe 50 workers. Their equipment was basic. Their ships were slow and poorly armed. According to our intelligence, they should not have been able to resist even a single Velthari patrol ship. But they did resist? Darwin asked quietly. More than resist, Korthak said with something like admiration in his voice. They taught us that we knew nothing about real fighting. He sat down again and closed his eyes, remembering. The mining station was run by a human called Jiho Kim. He was 34 years old and had worked in space mining for 12 years. His second in command was a female called Minseo Park. She was the chief engineer and had designed many of the station modifications herself. Korthak opened his eyes and looked directly at Hyunsu. When Commander Vexoth's fleet decloaked and demanded surrender, do you know what Jiho Kim did? The young warrior shook his head. He asked for 5 minutes to evacuate non-essential personnel. Commander Vexoth laughed and gave him 2 minutes. He thought he was being generous to weak prey. The elder's scarred face showed no emotion, but his voice carried a strange tone. In those 2 minutes, everything changed. The mining station that looked so helpless began to transform. Hidden panels opened up all over the asteroid surfaces. Weapon platforms that had been disguised as mining equipment swiveled toward our ships. The loose rocks floating nearby suddenly lit up with targeting systems. Several of the young warriors gasped. Such deception was not the Velthari way. They fought with honor, showing their weapons openly. Minseo Park had spent years preparing for this day, Korthak continued. She had built defenses into every part of the mining operation. She had turned innocent mining tools into weapons of war. She had hidden military-grade shields inside what looked like storage containers. But Elder, interrupted Jisoo, surely your fleet was still stronger. You had warships against a mining station. Korthak nodded slowly. Yes, we were stronger. Our ships had better armor, better weapons, better shields. We should have won easily. Commander Vexoth was so confident that he decided to capture the station intact instead of destroying it. He wanted to study their mining techniques. The old warrior stood up again and walked to the nearest carved pillar. He traced one of the battle scenes with his claw. Vexoth ordered boarding parties to take the station by force. I led the first team myself. We cut through their outer hull in minutes. Their defenses seemed to crumble before our assault. He turned, back to the circle. But as we moved deeper into the station, we realized we were walking into a trap. What kind of trap? Asked Xiongmin. The kind only humans could imagine, Korthak replied. Minseo Park had designed the station with multiple layers of defense. The outer areas were meant to be sacrificed. As we advanced, she sealed doors behind us and opened others in front of us. She was guiding us exactly where she wanted us to go. The elder began pacing again, his movements showing old battle reflexes. In the deeper sections, we encountered the humans face to face for the first time. They were so small, so fragile looking. Many of my warriors hesitated to attack what looked like defenseless prey. Did the humans surrender when they saw you? Asked Darwin. No, Korthak said firmly. They attacked us with mining tools. Plasma, cutters meant for rock became weapons against our armor. Industrial manipulator arms became clubs that could crush bone. They threw explosive charges originally meant for breaking up asteroids. He stopped pacing and his voice became quieter. But the most shocking thing was not their weapons. It was how they fought. They did not retreat when wounded. They did not abandon positions when outnumbered. They fought like every single meter of their station was worth dying for. Surely they could not hurt trained Veltari warriors, protested. Korthak lifted his left arm and showed them a long scar across his forearm. This came from a human called Dongyun Park. He was Minseo's younger brother, only 23 years old. He was not a soldier. He was a communications technician who fixed broken equipment. The young warriors stared at the scar in disbelief. Dongyun Park died fighting 3 Veltari warriors with nothing but a plasma cutter and a piece of broken pipe. But before he died, he managed to wound all 3 of us and delay our advance long enough for other humans to prepare their next defense. Korthak sat down heavily, suddenly looking very old. When Minseo Park found her brother's body, she did something that still gives me nightmares. She rigged the station's mining equipment to release superheated plasma through the air recycling system. She poisoned her own air, Yejin asked in horror. She turned her own home into a death trap, Korthak confirmed. She knew it would kill any humans still in those sections. She did not care. All she cared about was stopping us from advancing further. The hall was completely silent except for the sound of breathing. Minseo Park died activating that system, Korthak continued. The plasma burned through her protective suit in seconds, but her sacrifice gave the remaining humans time to reach their escape pods. What about your boarding parties? Asked Hyunsu quietly. Half of my warriors died in the plasma release, Korthak said without emotion. The others were trapped in sealed sections as the station began to break apart around us. We had to cut our way out through hull plating while the structure collapsed. He looked around the circle at the shocked faces of the young warriors. Commander Vexoth was furious. We had lost more warriors taking one small mining station than we usually lost conquering entire planets. He ordered the remaining humans killed and their escape pods destroyed. Did he succeed? Asked Dawan for the first time since beginning his story. Korthak smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. That, he said, is when we learned that attacking humans was the worst mistake Commander Vexoth ever made. Because someone on Earth was listening to their distress signals. Someone who would teach us what real danger looked like. The young warriors leaned forward eagerly, their earlier skepticism completely forgotten. Who was listening, Elder? Asked Yejin. Korthak Quotes' smile grew wider, showing his sharp teeth. A human starship captain called Seonho Lee, and he was very angry about what we had done to his people. The young Velthari warriors sat perfectly still as Elder Korthak continued his story. The great hall seemed even darker now, with shadows dancing across the carved pillars like ghosts of ancient battles. Captain Seonho Lee was commanding an experimental, human vessel called the Indomitable, Korthak began. It was part of their new deep space fleet, designed for long-range missions far from Earth. The Elder walked slowly around the circle, his claws clicking against the stone floor. When the distress signal from the mining colony reached Earth, the human military faced a choice. They could send a proper rescue fleet that would take months to arrive, or they could send whatever was available immediately. They chose the immediate option, asked Minho. Captain Lee did not wait for orders, Korthak replied. The moment he heard that humans were under attack, he departed for our system with only his single ship. No backup, no support vessels, no reinforcements. Yejin looked confused. One ship against an entire Velthari fleet? That is not tactics, Elder. That is suicide. Korthak nodded slowly. That is what Commander Vexoth thought too. When our sensors detected the approaching human vessel, he laughed. He could not believe they had sent only one small ship to face 50 Velthari warships. The old warrior stopped walking and faced the circle directly. Captain Lee's ship should have taken 3 weeks to reach our system using standard hyperspace travel, but Lee did something that our tactical computers said was impossible. What did he do? Asked Dawan. He used a technique humans call cascade jumping, Korthak explained. Instead of making one long hyperspace jump, he made dozens of short jumps in rapid sequence. Each jump pushed his ship's engines beyond their safe limits. Shungmin frowned. Would that not destroy his vessel? It should have, Korthak agreed. Our scientists later calculated that Captain Lee had a 60% chance of destroying his own ship with that technique. But he did it anyway because every hour he saved meant more human lives might survive. The elder began pacing again, his movements becoming more energetic as the story continued. Lee arrived in our system just as Commander Vexoth was preparing to destroy the human escape pods. The timing was perfect, but Lee's ship was damaged from the cascade jumping. His engines were running at 30% power and his weapons were only partially functional. What could one damaged ship do against 50? Asked Hyunsu. Korthak. S scarred face showed something that might have been admiration. Captain Lee did something that no Velthari commander would ever consider. He threw away every rule of proper space combat and fought like a desperate animal protecting its young. The young warriors leaned forward, fascinated despite themselves. The moment Lee's ship came out of hyperspace, he began broadcasting on all frequencies. He told Commander Vexoth that if even one human was killed, he would make the Velthari pay, a price they could not imagine. Empty threats, scoffed Jisoo. That is what Vexoth thought, Korthak said. So he ordered the escape pods destroyed immediately, just to show this human captain how powerless he was. The elder stopped pacing and his voice became very quiet. That was Commander Vexoth's final mistake. What happened? Whispered Dawan. Captain Lee proved that humans do not make empty threats, Korthak replied. The moment the first escape pod was destroyed, Lee's ship accelerated to ramming speed and aimed directly at Vexoth's flagship. Several young warriors gasped. Ramming. Attacks were considered dishonorable even in desperate situations. But Lee was not planning to ram us, Korthak continued. At the last second, he fired his ship's emergency thrusters and spun away from collision course. Instead, he fired every weapon he had at point-blank range into our engine section. The elder gestured with his claws, showing the movement of the ships. The damage was severe, but not critical. Vexoth's ship was wounded, but still functional. However, Lee had accomplished something more important than simple damage. What was that? Asked Minho. He had shown every human in those escape pods that someone had come to save them, Korthak said simply. And he had shown every Velthari warrior that this human was willing to die fighting for his people. The old warrior sat down again, his yellow eyes reflecting the dim light. What followed became known among our people as the impossible hour. For 60 minutes, one damaged human ship held off our entire fleet while simultaneously rescuing escape pods. How is that possible? Demanded Jisoo. Captain Lee used tactics that violated every law of space warfare, Korthak explained. He used his ship's cargo bay as a weapon, ejecting containers filled with explosive materials into our formation. He overloaded his defensive shields and rammed smaller Velthari vessels. He even weaponized his ship's waste disposal system. The young warriors looked at each other in amazement. Such improvisation was beyond anything they had learned in tactical training. But the most incredible part was how he coordinated with the surviving humans, Korthak continued. The miners in the escape pods were still fighting back, using their small ships as decoys and distractions. They had no weapons, but they drew our fire away from Lee's ship. They were helping him fight? Asked Hyunsu. More than helping, Korthak said. They were working together like parts of a single organism. Lee would create openings in our formations and the miners would fly through those openings to safety. The miners would distract our gunners, and Lee would attack from unexpected angles. The elder stood up again, his movements showing old battle reflexes. I was aboard Vexoth's flagship when Lee made his final attack run. Our ship was badly damaged, but still the most powerful vessel in the fleet. Lee's ship was barely holding together. Any rational commander would have retreated. Did he retreat? Asked Dawan. Korthak shook his head slowly. Captain Lee opened a communication channel to our bridge. I will never forget his words. He said, "You want to see what humans do when you threaten our people? Watch this." The hall became completely silent. Lee rigged his ship's fusion reactor to overload. Korthak continued quietly. He aimed his dying vessel directly at our flagship and prepared to sacrifice himself to destroy us. A suicide attack, whispered Yejin. The most effective suicide attack in recorded history, Korthak confirmed. But Lee did not die for nothing. His sacrifice allowed every remaining human to escape. Not one more civilian was lost. The young warriors sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had heard. Commander Vexoth survived the collision, Korthak added. But his flagship was destroyed and half our fleet was damaged beyond repair. We limped back to Velthari space, defeated by a single human ship. What happened to the rescued humans? Asked Shungmin. They returned to Earth and told their people what had occurred, Korthak replied. Within months, every human in their space knew the story of Captain Xianho Li and the miners he died to save. The elder looked around the circle at the thoughtful faces of the young warriors. That story changed how humans saw themselves and their place in the galaxy, but it also changed how we saw them. How so, elder? Asked Minho. Korthak, quote S. scarred. Features showed something like respect. We realized that any species willing to fight that hard for each other could never be conquered. You cannot defeat an enemy that refuses to abandon their own, no matter the cost. The old warrior sat down, one final time, but we did not understand the full truth about humans until we captured some of the miners and tried to question them. That is when we learned the most terrifying thing of all about these creatures. What did you learn? Asked Dawn in a small voice. Korthak smiled, showing his sharp teeth. I will tell you tomorrow, young hunters. Tonight, think about what you have heard. Think about what it means to fight not for victory, but for others. The gathering began to disperse, but the young warriors moved slowly, their minds full of impossible images of humans fighting against overwhelming odds. As they left the great hall, each one was wondering the same thing. What could be more terrifying than an enemy that refused to give up? The next evening, the young Velthari warriors gathered in the great hall again. They had spent the day thinking about Elder Korthak's story, and many had found it difficult to concentrate on their training. The idea of enemies who fought not for victory but for each other was deeply troubling to their ordered minds. Elder Korthak entered the hall as the last light faded outside. His heavy footsteps echoed off the stone walls as he made his way to the center of the circle. Tonight his yellow eyes seemed even brighter, as if lit by some inner fire. You have returned, he observed, settling himself on the cold floor. Good. Tonight I will tell you about our greatest mistake. The young warriors shifted restlessly. They had expected to hear more battle stories, tales of ships and weapons and tactical maneuvers. The word mistake suggested something different. After the battle at the mining colony, Korthak began, our fleet retreated to regroup and treat our wounded. But we did not return empty-handed. We had managed to capture 3 humans from the mining station before Captain Li arrived. Yejin leaned forward with interest. Prisoners could provide valuable intelligence about human capabilities. That is exactly what Commander Vexoth thought, Korthak agreed. One of the prisoners was Jiho Kim, the mining supervisor. He had been badly wounded in the fighting but was still alive. The other 2 were technicians named Sunho Kang and Nyan Cho. The elder paused and flexed his claws thoughtfully. Vexoth ordered the prisoners taken to Intelligence Officer Nexara for questioning. Nexara was considered the best interrogator in the Third Fleet. She had broken thousands of prisoners from dozens of species. What did she learn from the humans? Asked Minho. Korthak. Quote S. scarred face showed something that might have been embarrassment. Nothing, he said simply. For the first time in her career, Intelligence Officer Nexara learned nothing useful from her prisoners. Several young warriors looked confused. Jisoo spoke for all of them. How could trained interrogators fail to break 3 wounded prisoners? Surely humans cannot resist proper questioning techniques. That is what Nexara thought, Korthak replied. She began with standard procedures: isolation, discomfort, psychological pressure. These methods work on most species because they attack the individual's will to survive. The elder stood up and began his familiar pacing around the circle. But the humans reacted strangely to isolation. Instead of becoming desperate for contact, they seemed to grow calmer. They spent their time thinking, planning, observing. When guards brought them food, they studied the guards' behavior patterns and equipment. They were gathering intelligence on us? Asked Hyun-soo with surprise. Constantly, Korthak confirmed. Even while being tortured, they were learning about their captors. Nexara realized this after several days and moved to more direct methods. The old warrior stopped pacing and faced the circle. She brought Jiho Kim to the main interrogation chamber. His wounds were still healing and he could barely walk without assistance. Nexara thought his weakened condition would make him more cooperative. Did it work? Asked Dawn. Nexara began with pain enhancement, Korthak explained. Techniques designed to amplify the body's natural pain responses. Most prisoners break within hours. The young warriors nodded. They had all heard of such methods in their military training. Jiho Kim endured 6 hours of pain enhancement without giving up any meaningful information. Korthak continued. When Nexara asked why humans had fought so hard for a worthless mining station, he said something that confused her completely. What did he say? Asked Shungmen. Korthak. Quote's voice took on a different tone, as if he were quoting something he had memorized. He said you killed Dongyun Park. He was 23 years old. He collected old earth music and wanted to be a composer. Minseo talked about him every day. When you killed him, you did not just kill one human. You killed a piece of everyone who knew him. The hall was silent for a long moment. The young warriors tried to understand what this meant. Nexara was confused. By this response, Korthak continued. In Velthari society, the death of weak individuals is natural selection. The strong survive and the weak are forgotten. But Jiho Kim spoke as if the death of one unimportant technician mattered to everyone. Did Nexara continue the interrogation? Asked Yejin. She tried different approaches, Korthak said. Threats against the other prisoners, promises of better treatment, even offers of freedom. Nothing worked. The humans seemed to have an infinite capacity for enduring hardship. The elder sat down again, his movements showing his age. But the most disturbing moment came when Nexara asked Jiho Kim about Captain Seonho Lee. She wanted to understand why a military officer would sacrifice himself for civilians he had never met. What did he tell her? Asked Minho. Jiho Kim looked directly at Nexara and said, Captain Lee had never met any of us before yesterday. But when he heard humans were in danger, he came anyway. That is what humans do. We do not abandon our own. Several young warriors exchanged glances. This concept was difficult for them to understand. Nexara pressed him for details, Korthak continued. She wanted to know if Captain Lee was related to any of the miners or if he had been ordered to attempt the rescue. The answers she received troubled her deeply. Why? Asked Dawan. Because Captain Lee had disobeyed direct orders to attempt the rescue, Korthak explained. His superiors had told him to wait for proper reinforcements. He chose to ignore those orders because he believed saving human lives was more important than following protocol. The young warriors looked shocked. Disobeying orders was one of the gravest crimes in Velthari military law. Nexara could not understand this behavior, Korthak said. She asked Jiho Kim what punishment Captain Lee would have faced if he had survived. The answer was even more confusing. What punishment? Asked Jisoo. None, Korthak replied. According to Jiho Kim, Captain Lee would have been celebrated as a hero by all humans. His disobedience would have been seen as evidence of good judgment, not criminal behavior. The elder stood up and walked to one of the carved pillars, studying the ancient battle scenes. Nexara spent 3 more days trying to break the human prisoners. She used every technique in her arsenal: pain, fear, isolation, confusion, false hope, crushing despair. Nothing worked. How could they resist so effectively? Asked Hyun-soo. Korthak turned back to face the circle, his yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. On the final day, Nexara made a discovery that changed everything. She realized that the humans were not resisting interrogation through individual strength. What do you mean? Asked Jungmin. They were supporting each other, Korthak explained. Even in separate cells, even under torture, They maintained some form of connection. When one prisoner was being questioned, the others would find ways to show they were still there, still fighting. The young warriors looked puzzled. Such coordination should have been impossible under their prison conditions. How could they communicate? While isolated, asked Yejin. They used sounds that carried through the ship's structure, Korthak said. Tapping on pipes, rhythmic breathing, even the timing of their movements. They created a code that let them share strength even when they could not speak. The elder began pacing again, his footsteps marking time with his words. Nexara finally understood why her interrogation was failing. She was not trying to break 3 individual prisoners. She was trying to break a single collective will that refused to be separated. Did she find a way to break them? Asked Doan. For the first time in his story, Korthak smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. That question became irrelevant, he said, because while Nexara was trying to break our prisoners, one of them was studying her. Studying her how? Asked Minho with alarm. Dr. Yuna Choi was the mining colony's xenobiologist, Korthak explained. While pretending to be broken, by interrogation she had been observing Velthari behavior patterns and social structures. The young warriors leaned forward with sudden interest. This sounded like the beginning of another battle story. Dr. Choi discovered something that even we had never recognized about ourselves, Korthak continued. Something that would soon turn the tables completely. What did she discover? Asked Yejin. Korthak. Quote's scarred face showed something like respect mixed with fear. She learned that for all our individual strength, we Velthari have a critical weakness. A weakness so fundamental that we had never even noticed it ourselves. The old warrior sat down heavily, suddenly looking very tired. But before I tell you about Dr. Choi's discovery, I must tell you about the rescue attempt. Because while Nexara was failing to break our prisoners, someone on Earth was planning something impossible. Another rescue? Asked Hyunsu. Not just any rescue, Korthak replied. A mission so audacious that our tactical computers could not even calculate the probability of success. The young warriors waited eagerly, their earlier skepticism about human capabilities now completely forgotten. Who was coming to save them? Asked Dowan. Korthak looked around the circle at all the eager faces staring back at him. Major Taewon, Young and his Special Forces unit, he said, and they were about to teach us that rescuing 3 prisoners from a heavily fortified Velthari facility was not impossible. Just very, very dangerous. The third evening found the young Velthari warriors arriving early to the Great Hall. Word had spread through the training barracks about Elder Korthak's stories, and now other warriors were trying to listen from the corridors. But Korthak had ordered the doors sealed. These lessons were for the young hunters alone. The old warrior entered with his usual measured pace, but tonight there was something different about him. His movements seemed more careful, as if he were carrying some great weight. When he settled into the center of the circle, his yellow eyes held a distant look. Tonight I will tell you about the day we learned that humans could do something we thought was impossible, he began without preamble. The day they taught us that we did not understand ourselves as well as we believed. The young warriors leaned forward eagerly. They had spent 2 days discussing Korthak's previous stories, and their curiosity had grown beyond containment. Major Taewon Jung commanded a human special forces unit called the Void Stalkers, Korthak continued. When Earth learned that 3 humans were being held prisoner by our fleet, Jung volunteered to lead a rescue mission. How could they find your fleet in deep space? Asked Minho. Surely you were not broadcasting your location. Korthak's scarred face showed something like grim amusement. We thought we were hidden, he said. Our fleet was stationed in an empty system 3 days' travel from the mining colony. No planets, no resources, no reason for anyone to look for us there. But the humans found you anyway? Asked Yejin. Major Jung tracked us using methods that our intelligence officers still do not fully understand, Korthak replied. He followed the radiation signatures of our damaged ships, analyzed the gravitational disturbances of our fleet movements, and even used the communication patterns of our own rescue calls. The elder stood up and began his familiar pacing. Jung's team consisted of only 12 humans in a single stealth vessel. Their mission was supposed to be impossible. Our fleet included 47 ships with full defensive screens and thousands of trained warriors. What was their plan? Asked Yunsu. They had no plan, Korthak said simply. Major Jung later told our intelligence officers that detailed planning would have been useless against an unknown enemy in an unknown situation. Several young warriors looked confused. Military doctrine emphasized careful planning and preparation. Instead, Jung's team relied on something they called adaptive improvisation, Korthak explained. They would assess the situation in real time and create solutions as needed. That sounds like chaos, not tactics, protested Jisoo. That is what Commander Vexoth thought, Korthak agreed. When our sensors detected the approaching human vessel, he was confident it would be destroyed before it could even reach our defensive perimeter. The old warrior stopped pacing and faced the circle directly. The human attack began at exactly midnight ship time. Jung's vessel approached from the direction of the system's star, using solar radiation to mask their energy signature. A basic, stealth approach, observed Sungmin. Nothing revolutionary. The approach was ordinary, Korthak confirmed, but what happened next was anything but ordinary. The elder sat down again, his movements showing old battle reflexes. Jung's team did not attack our ships directly. Instead, they launched a dozen small penetrator pods toward our fleet. Each pod contained sophisticated jamming equipment designed to disrupt our communication systems. Communication jamming, said Dawan, a reasonable tactic. More than reasonable, Korthak said. It was brilliant, because while our attention was focused on the external threat, we failed to notice that our prisoners had been waiting for exactly this moment. The young warriors suddenly looked more alert. They sensed the story was approaching its climax. Dr. Yuna Choi had spent weeks studying our behavior patterns, Korthak continued. She had identified something about Velthari psychology that even our own scientists had missed. What did she discover? Asked Yejin quietly. Korthak was silent for a long moment, as if the memory was painful. She realized that despite our individual strength, we are fundamentally pack hunters. Our entire social structure is based on dominance hierarchies and chain of command protocols. That is obvious, said Minho. All military organizations require chain of command. Yes, Korthak agreed. But Dr. Choi understood that our dependence on hierarchy was also our greatest weakness. When that hierarchy is disrupted, we become confused and ineffective. The elder stood up again and walked to the nearest carved pillar. During the communication jamming attack, Dr. Choi put her theory to the test. She had memorized the behavior patterns of every guard and officer who had contact with the prisoners. She knew who was dominant, who was submissive, and how they interacted with each other. How could that knowledge help her escape? Asked Hyunsu. She did not try to escape, Korthak said. She tried to create chaos in our command structure. The young warriors exchanged puzzled glances. Using the limited communication methods available to her, Dr. Choi began sending false messages between different levels of our hierarchy, Korthak explained. She used the ship's internal systems to make it appear that senior officers were issuing contradictory orders. False orders? Asked Dawan with growing alarm. Very carefully crafted false orders, Korthak confirmed. Dr. Choi understood that Velthari officers would respond to certain types of challenges in predictable ways. She triggered competition between commanders who should have been cooperating. The elder turned back to face the circle, his expression grim. Within minutes of the external attack beginning, our internal command structure began to collapse. Officers were challenging each other's authority instead of responding to the threat. Guards were abandoning their posts to settle dominance disputes. A single prisoner caused all of the, asked Jisoo in disbelief. A single prisoner who understood us better than we understood ourselves, Korthak replied. Dr. Choi turned our own instincts against us. The old warrior began pacing again, his movements showing agitation. The research facility where our prisoners were held was defended by some of our most elite warriors, but when Major Jung's penetrator teams reached the facility, they found the defenses in complete disarray. What had happened? Asked Sungmin. Dr. Choi had convinced the facility commander That his second-in-command was planning to challenge his authority, Korthak explained. She made the second-in-command believe that junior officers were questioning his competence. She created suspicion and paranoia throughout the entire command structure. The young warriors sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were hearing. By the time Jung's team breached the facility, half the defenders were fighting each other instead of defending. Against the attack, Korthak continued. The other half were paralyzed by conflicting orders from different officers. How did Major Jung's team penetrate the facility? Asked Minho. They walked in through the main entrance, Korthak said simply. The guard posts were abandoned because the guards had been called away to settle disputes between their superiors. The elder sat down heavily, his scarred face showing something like shame. Jung's team found Dr. Choi calmly waiting for them in the main detention area. She had already freed the other prisoners and secured important intelligence about our fleet capabilities. She was not trying to escape? Asked Yejin. She was waiting for rescue, Korthak replied, because she knew that humans would never abandon their own, no matter how difficult the rescue might be. The old warrior looked around the circle at the shocked faces of the young hunters. The extraction took less than 20 minutes, he continued. By the time our command structure had sorted itself out enough to respond effectively, Jung's team and all the prisoners were gone. What about casualties? Asked Hyunsu. That is the most humiliating part, Korthak admitted. Jung's team suffered no casualties during the rescue. We lost 17 warriors, but they all died fighting each other, not fighting the humans. The hall was completely silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant wind outside. Dr. Choi's intelligence allowed the humans to understand our tactical methods, our ship designs, and our psychological weaknesses. Korthak continued. Within months, every human military unit had detailed information about how to defeat Velthari forces. Did this intelligence lead to more attacks on our people? Asked Dawan quietly. No, Korthak said, and his voice carried a strange tone. That is when we learned the most disturbing thing about humans. What did you learn? Asked Shungmin. Korthak's yellow eyes seemed to glow brighter in the dim light. The humans shared Dr. Choi's intelligence with every other species in the galaxy, he said. Not just their allies, but everyone, even species they had never contacted before. Several young warriors gasped in amazement. Why would they give away such valuable information? Asked Jisoo. Because, Korthak said slowly, humans believe that everyone has the right to defend themselves against predators. The old warrior stood up one final time and looked at each young face in the circle. That decision changed everything, he said. Within a year, dozens of species had learned how to resist Velthari tactics. Our expansion came to a halt. For the first time in our history, we faced enemies who understood our weaknesses. What did the High Council do? Asked Minho. Korthak smiled, showing his sharp teeth. But for the first time, it was not a predator's SM. Elder Korthak rose to his feet one final time, his ancient joints creaking with the weight of years and battles. The young warriors had grown completely silent, their earlier excitement replaced by something deeper, something that might have been understanding. The Velthari High Command met in emergency session for 7 days, he began, his voice carrying the weight of history. Every elder, every military commander, every intelligence analyst gathered to discuss what we had learned about humans. The old warrior walked slowly around the circle, his footsteps echoing in the vast hall. Elder Vorthak, the most ancient and respected member of our council, presented the final analysis. He had lived for over 400 years and had overseen the conquest of 93 different species. What did he conclude? Asked Yejin, her voice barely above a whisper. That in all those centuries, in all those conquests, we had never encountered anything like humans, Korthak replied. Every other species we had fought followed predictable patterns. The strong dominated the weak. The individual mattered less than the group. Survival was the highest priority. He stopped walking and faced the center of the circle. Humans violated every natural law we understood. How so? Asked Minho. Elder Vorthak presented footage from multiple human encounters, Korthak explained. We watched recordings of their actions across dozens of incidents. Each one showed the same impossible behavior. The elder's voice became thoughtful. We saw a human engineer called Kyungjae Nam turn a civilian transport ship into a weapons platform using nothing but spare parts and maintenance tools. When pirates attacked his vessel, he had no weapons, no shields, no trained soldiers. What did he do? Asked Dawan. He reprogrammed the ship's waste disposal system to launch compressed garbage at high velocity, Korthak said with something like admiration. He turned the food synthesizers into chemical weapon dispensers. He used the artificial gravity generators to create crushing force fields. The young warriors listened in amazement. The pirates had superior ships and professional fighters, Korthak continued, but Kyungjae Nam fought them to a standstill for 6 hours using devices meant for cleaning toilets and preparing meals. Did he win? Asked Seungmin. He saved every passenger on his ship, Korthak replied. That was all he cared about winning. The old warrior began pacing again. We studied another incident involving a human diplomat called Ariam's son. She was captured by Zephyrite raiders who planned to sell her as a slave. Zephyrites are mind readers, observed Jisoo. How could any prisoner escape them? Ariam's son did not try to escape, Korthak said. Instead, she convinced her captors that keeping her alive was more profitable than selling her. How did she do that? Asked Hyunsoo. By teaching them something they had never considered, Korthak replied. She showed them that humans were more valuable as allies than as slaves. She negotiated trade agreements, shared technological knowledge, and established communication protocols. The elder's voice carried a note of wonder. Within 3 days, the Zephyrite raiders had released not just Ariam's son, but every other slave they held. They wanted to become trading partners with humanity instead of enemies. One human diplomat changed an entire raider clan? Dawan asked in disbelief. She did more than that, Korthak said. 6 months later, that same clan was fighting alongside human forces against other raiders. Ariam's son had turned enemies into allies through nothing but words and ideas. The young warriors exchanged amazed glances. We studied dozens of similar cases, Korthak continued. A human medic called Wonho Bae treated wounded soldiers from 4 different species during a battle. Some were his allies, some were his enemies. He saved them all. He helped enemy soldiers? Asked Minho in confusion. He said that wounded beings were not enemies, just patients who needed help, Korthak explained. The alien soldiers he saved were so impressed that they switched sides in the middle of the battle. The elder sat down heavily. But the most disturbing pattern was what happened to other species after they encountered humans. What happened to them? Asked Yejin. They changed, Korthak said quietly. Species that had been enemies for centuries started cooperating. Predator races began showing mercy to their prey. Entire civilizations adopted human concepts like protecting the weak and fighting for others. He looked around the circle at the young faces staring back at him. Elder Vorthak called it infection, but not the kind that makes you sick. The kind that makes you think differently about everything. What did the council conclude? Asked Shungman. Korthak, quote, S voice became very serious. That humans were not just another species to conquer. They were something we had never encountered before in all our history. They were transformers. What does that mean? Asked Dawan. It means they change everything they touch, Korthak explained. Not through force or manipulation, but through example. They show other species what is possible when beings care about each other instead of just themselves. The old warrior stood up again and walked to one of the carved pillars. He traced the battle scenes with his claw. The council faced a choice. We could try to destroy humanity before their influence spread further, or we could accept that the galaxy was changing and decide how we wanted to fit into that change. What did they decide? Asked Jisoo. Elder Vorthak reminded us of something important, Korthak said. For all our strength, for all our victories, we Velthari had never inspired loyalty in our conquered subjects. We ruled through fear and dominated through force. He turned back to face the circle. Humans ruled through something we had no word for in our language, something they called hope. Hope? Yejin repeated the unfamiliar concept. The belief that things can get better, Korthak explained. The idea that sacrifice today can create a better tomorrow for others. Humans fight not just to survive, but to build something worth surviving for. The young warriors sat in thoughtful silence, trying to understand this alien concept. The council's decree was unanimous, Korthak continued. Humans were to be classified as a protected species, not because they were weak, but because they were the most dangerous predators we had ever encountered. Dangerous how? Asked Hyunsu. Because they hunt not for food or territory or dominance, Korthak replied. They hunt for the transformation of others. They take the concept of being prey and turn it into strength. They make others want to be better than they are. The elder returned to his place in the center of the circle. Any species that can inspire others to fight for strangers, to sacrifice for those they have never met, to choose hope over survival, is not prey. They are apex, predators of a type we never imagined. Is that why we tell their stories to our youth? Asked Minho. Korthak nodded slowly. Because there is no greater honor for a predator than to learn from the most successful hunters in the galaxy. We tell their stories not as warnings, but as lessons in what true strength looks like. He looked around the circle one final time. The humans taught us that the greatest predators are not those who kill the most prey, but those who ensure their pack survives and grows stronger. The old warrior's voice became soft but clear. They showed us that sometimes the most ruthless thing you can do is refuse to be ruthless at all. The young warriors sat in stunned silence, their understanding of strength and weakness completely transformed. You will go on your first hunt tomorrow, Korthak said. Remember what you have learned here. Remember that true danger does not always come from sharp claws or advanced weapons. Sometimes it comes from beings who are willing to die for others, who choose sacrifice over survival, who turn weakness into strength through sheer force of will. He stood up slowly, his story finished. And remember that in a galaxy full of apex predators, the humans achieved something none of us had ever imagined. They made themselves indispensable not through conquest, but through the simple act of being willing to fight for others as fiercely as they fought for themselves. The hall remained silent for a long moment. The young warriors looked at each other with new understanding in their eyes. Everything they thought they knew about strength and weakness had been challenged. Finally, Yejin spoke, her voice thoughtful. Elder, if humans are so powerful through their willingness to help others, what does that make us? Korthak smiled, showing his worn teeth. It was the first genuine smile he had shown since beginning his tale. It makes us students, he said simply. Students learning from the greatest teachers the galaxy has ever produced. He walked toward the great doors of the hall, then stopped and looked back at the circle of young faces. Your hunt begins tomorrow, but remember this lesson above all: others. The most successful predators in the galaxy are not those who take the most prey. They are those who create the strongest packs. The humans understood this long before we did. As the old warrior reached the doorway, Dawan called out one final question. Elder, will we ever meet humans ourselves? Korthak paused at the threshold, his scarred form silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor beyond. Perhaps, he said quietly. And if you do, remember that you are meeting beings who would cross the galaxy to save strangers, who would sacrifice everything for people they have never met, and who would choose certain death over abandoning their own. He looked back one last time. Remember that they are the reason the Velthari Empire still exists. Not because